Ryan grew up inside that company the way some children grow up inside a church. It was the center of our family's identity, the rhythm of our week, the source of every good thing we had. Gerald took him to job sites on Saturdays. Ryan learned to read blueprints before he learned long division. By the time he was in high school, he could estimate material costs on a residential project faster than most of our project managers. Gerald was so proud of him, it almost hurt to watch. "He's going to take this further than we ever did," Gerald said to me one evening. We were sitting on the back porch of the house we'd finally bought, a real house, with a yard and a garden and enough space that we didn't have to whisper when we argued. "I can feel it, Maggie. That boy has everything we didn't have starting out." I agreed with him. I didn't know then that what Ryan had, including everything we'd given him, was exactly what would make him dangerous. Gerald died on a Wednesday in October, 10 years ago now. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a long illness that gave us time to say everything we needed to say. It was a heart attack, sudden and absolute, in the parking lot of a lumber supplier he'd been working with for 20 years. He was 61 years old. He was healthy, or we thought he was. He was there, and then he wasn't, and the space he left behind was so enormous that for the first 6 months after the funeral, I used to walk into rooms of our house and just stand there, completely still, unable to remember why I'd come in or where I was supposed to go next. Ryan was 30 at the time. He'd been working at Hayes Construction for 5 years, learning the business properly, the way Gerald had always intended. In those first weeks after his father's death, he was everything I could have asked for. He was present. He helped with the arrangements. He sat with me in the evenings when the silence got too heavy. He held my hand at the cemetery without me having to ask. I thought grief had made him into the man Gerald always believed he could become. I ran the company alone through that first year. I won't pretend it was graceful. I made mistakes. I lost 2 contracts because I didn't move fast enough on bids, and I lost 1 long-term client because I trusted the wrong project manager and didn't catch the problem until it was too late. But I kept the business solvent. I kept all 23 employees on payroll. I restructured our debt, renegotiated 3 supplier agreements, and by the end of that first year without Gerald, Hayes Construction was not just surviving, it was growing again. Ryan worked alongside me through all of it, and I was grateful. More than I ever told him, I was grateful. The trouble when I look back with the clarity that only comes after you've been through the fire started long before I noticed it. It started the day Ryan brought Vanessa Cole home. She arrived on a Sunday afternoon in late spring, 2 years after Gerald's death. Ryan had mentioned her in passing. "Someone I've been seeing," he said, casual in the way men are casual about things that are not actually casual at all. I had expected someone warm, someone straightforward, someone who would shake my hand and look me in the eye the way people do when they have nothing to hide. Vanessa Cole was beautiful in a way that announced itself before she even spoke. Tall, dark-haired, with a kind of composed elegance that I associated with women who'd spent considerable time deciding how they wanted to be perceived. She wore a cream-colored blouse and dark trousers, and she carried herself like she was visiting, not meeting someone for the first time. She shook my hand, smiled, said, "Mrs. Hayes, Ryan has told me so much about you. This house is absolutely lovely." And I smiled back, because what was I going to say? That something in my chest had gone still the moment she walked through the door? That the way she looked around the living room, slowly, methodically, the way you look at something you're thinking of buying, made my palms go cold? I was being unfair, I told myself. I was a widow who was overprotective of her only son. I was projecting. I was letting my grief make me suspicious of an innocent woman. So I made coffee. I brought out the good cups. I asked her about herself. Vanessa Cole, I learned, was from Atlanta. Her father had been in commercial real estate. She had a business degree from Emory and had spent the past 6 years working in corporate marketing for a mid-sized firm in Columbus. She was 34. She was articulate and polished, and she said all the right things at precisely the right moments. "I really admire what you've built here," she told me at one point, glancing toward the framed photo of the company's 25th anniversary celebration that hung near the hallway. "Ryan talks about Hayes Construction like it's a member of the family. You must be incredibly proud." "I am," I said. She smiled again. "As you should be." Ryan was watching her the entire time with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a teenager. That look of someone who has decided that another person is the most important thing in the room and everything else is just background. It unsettled me more than anything Vanessa said or didn't say. After she left, Ryan walking her to her car, standing in the driveway for 20 minutes talking in low voices. I washed the good cups and stood at the kitchen sink and told myself I was being a foolish, lonely old woman. I was 58 years old. I was not old. But grief does something to your interior compass. It makes you doubt your own readings. I told myself to give it time. Yes. They were engaged 8 months later. I found out on a Thursday evening when Ryan called me from the restaurant where he'd apparently proposed, and Vanessa had apparently said yes immediately, without hesitation, before he'd even finished the sentence. He sounded different on the phone, breathless, almost giddy. And I told him congratulations, and I meant it. I truly did. Even though somewhere beneath that meaning was a cold and formless dread I could not have explained to anyone, not even myself. She wants to meet with you next week, Ryan said. She has some ideas. Ideas? About the wedding? About the future? She's very organized, Mom. You're going to love that about her. I did not ask what ideas she had about the future. I told myself it was about the wedding. That was a reasonable thing for an engaged woman to have ideas about. I was wrong about that too. The meeting, which is what it felt like, a meeting, not a family lunch, happened at the house on a Tuesday. Vanessa came with a leather portfolio. She set it on my kitchen table and opened it, and inside were printed documents with tabs and headers. Ryan sat beside her looking sheepish in the specific way people look when they've already agreed to something they know you're going to push back on. I've been doing some research, Vanessa began, on business succession planning for family companies. It's incredibly common and incredibly important to formalize the transition of ownership while the founder is still active and healthy. That way everyone is protected. I looked at the documents. I looked at Ryan. Transition to whom? Well, she smiled, the way she always smiled, composed, measured, like the expression was something she'd chosen carefully from a selection. To Ryan, as the natural heir. And eventually, as a couple, Ryan and I would be positioned to take Hayes Construction to the next level. I have a background in growth strategy, and Ryan has the operational expertise. It's a natural partnership. I sat with that for a moment. I'm 60 years old, I said. I'm not planning to retire. Of course not. This wouldn't require you to retire at all. It would just formalize. I understand what it would formalize, I said. There was a silence. Ryan looked at the table. Mom, he started. Ryan. My voice was quiet. I was proud of that. I didn't raise it. Not then. Not at that table on that Tuesday. I hear what you're both saying, and I'll think about it. Vanessa closed the portfolio, smiled again. Of course. There's no rush at all. But the thing about people who say there's no rush is that they almost always mean the opposite. They were married the following June. It was a beautiful wedding. I will give Vanessa that. She organized it with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything. The venue was a restored farmhouse outside the city. White lights strung through oak trees, 200 guests, a band that played Motown covers until 11 at night. She looked stunning. Ryan looked happier than I had seen him since before Gerald died. I danced at my son's wedding. I smiled at his bride. I held it together through the whole thing with the particular kind of endurance that older women in this country develop, because we are not given much of a choice. 6 weeks after the wedding, they moved into my house. This had been presented as temporary. Vanessa was between apartments. Her lease had ended and she and Ryan hadn't found the right place yet. Just a few months, Ryan said. It'll be easier for all of us. You're out there alone in that big house anyway. There it was. That phrase, that particular framing, out there alone. As though the house that Gerald and I had bought together, where we had raised our son, where I had rebuilt myself after Gerald died, was simply a place where I was existing without purpose until someone came along to give it one. Fine, I said. A few months. They moved in with 43 boxes and a sense of permanent arrangement. Within a week, things began to shift in ways that were small enough to dismiss and consistent enough to unsettle. Vanessa rearranged the kitchen. Not dramatically, not all at once. She moved the coffee mugs to a different cabinet, shifted the pantry items, reorganized the refrigerator. When I mentioned it, she said apologetically, that she'd just been trying to help, that she'd read about more efficient kitchen organization and thought I might appreciate it. I said it was fine. I moved some of the mugs back. The next day, they were in the new cabinet again. She began having work calls in the dining room during business hours, spreading her laptop and notebooks across the table I'd owned for 22 years, like she was setting up a satellite office. She started having opinions about the grocery order, the cable package, the temperature at which the thermostat was set. Each individual thing was defensible. Each individual thing could be explained as consideration or helpfulness or preference. Together, they were something else entirely. Ryan, meanwhile, began arriving at the company office later and later. He and Vanessa stayed up until 2 in the morning most nights. I could hear them through the wall, their voices low and continuous. And he'd come into the office looking exhausted and distracted, slipping out of meetings early to take calls in the parking lot. When I asked him what was going on, he said Vanessa was helping him develop a business plan, and he didn't want to get into it until it was further along. A business plan. For my company. Ryan, I said one afternoon when we were alone in my office and I'd closed the door deliberately, and he'd registered that and straightened in his chair the way he used to when he was in trouble as a teenager. I need you to be honest with me. I'm always honest with you. Then tell me what Vanessa's business plan involves. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she thinks we should incorporate a new holding entity, run the company through that. It would be more tax efficient, and it would allow us... He stopped. Allow you what? Allow us to restructure ownership in a way that's more... Another stop. Equitable. I looked at my son who had learned to read blueprints in this building, who had sat in this office with his father and watched how it was done, who had, I realize now, been sitting in this office with his wife and watching how it could be undone. Equitable, I repeated. Mom, this company was built by your father and me in 32 years, and you've been working here for 8. That's the arithmetic, Ryan. I know the arithmetic. Do you? He looked away. He had Gerald's jaw and Gerald's hands and absolutely none of Gerald's conscience, and that was the first time I truly understood that. Understood it as a fact rather than a fear. He left the office without another word. I sat there for a long time after, listening to the sounds of the building around me, the phones, the printers, a crew pulling out in the parking lot, and I thought about Gerald saying, "We don't cut corners, Maggie. That's the one thing we never do." Autumn arrived, and with it came Vanessa's escalation. In October, she told me, over dinner, that she and Ryan had consulted an attorney about a potential guardianship arrangement. She said it gently. She said she was concerned about my well-being. She said she'd noticed some things, some forgetfulness, some moments of confusion, and she just wanted to make sure I was properly supported. She said this while passing the breadbasket across the table, as though it were a routine piece of information. I set down my fork. Guardianship, I said. It's just a precaution, Vanessa said. Many people your age... I am 60 years old, Vanessa. Of course. And you're incredibly capable. She smiled. We just want to make sure we're all protected. The company, the house, everything you've worked so hard for. Everything I've worked so hard for belongs to me. Ryan was not looking at me. He was looking at his plate with the concentrated attention of someone watching a car crash and trying not to show he'd seen it coming. Mom, he said, can you just hear her out? I have heard her out. I pushed back my chair and stood up. I've heard enough. I left the dining room and went upstairs to my bedroom and sat on the edge of my bed, the bed I'd shared with Gerald for over 3 decades, and pressed my hands flat on my knees to stop them shaking. Not from fear. I want to be clear about that. I was not afraid. I was angry. I was angry in the deep, clean way you get angry when you finally understand what's been happening. Not the confusion of it, not the maybe I'm reading this wrong of it, but the cold, certain clarity of seeing a thing as exactly what it is. I was being moved against, deliberately and systematically, and the person doing it was sitting in my dining room eating my food. I picked up my phone. I called a woman named Clara Whitfield. Clara had been my accountant for 16 years. I asked her to pull every financial record for Hayes Construction going back 18 months, every transaction, every account. Everything? Clara said. Everything, I said. Margaret, Is something that, just pull it, please. I'll come in Thursday. I hung up. I sat in the quiet of my bedroom for a long time. Outside, I could hear Vanessa's voice downstairs, lower now, murmuring to Ryan. Soft, patient, relentless. I thought about what Gerald would have said. He would have said, find out what they've done. Don't guess. No. So that's what I did. Clara's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that Gerald and I had driven past 1,000 times before we ever needed an accountant. I'd always liked the old stone facade of it, the heavy brass door handles. There was something trustworthy about buildings that had been standing for a long time. Clara had everything printed out when I arrived. 18 months of transactions, flagged and sorted, spread across her conference table in organized piles. She poured me coffee and sat down across from me and looked at me with the expression of someone who has found something they wish they hadn't. Tell me, I said. There are 47 transactions I can't account for, she said. In total, across 3 accounts, approximately $230,000 has been moved in ways that don't correspond to any legitimate business expense I can identify. I looked at the papers. Moved where? 2 separate accounts. Both were opened in the past 14 months. Both have Ryan listed as the sole account holder. She paused. The authorization on several of these transfers includes what appears to be your signature, Margaret, but the signature doesn't match what I have on record from you. I was very still. You're saying my signature was forged? I'm saying the signature doesn't match, Clara said carefully. I'm not an expert in document fraud, but I would recommend you consult one. I looked at the stack of papers. $230,000, 47 transactions, a forged signature. Is there more? I asked. Potentially, she said. I've only gone back 18 months. If you want me to go further, I said. Go back 3 years. Go back 5 if you need to. She nodded, then she hesitated. Margaret, you need an attorney, a good one. I can give you a name. The name she gave me was Diana Reeves. I called Diana Reeves that same afternoon. Diana Reeves was 53 years old and had been practicing civil and family law for over 25 years. She had short silver hair and wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had the particular quality of attention, focused, unhurried, absolute, that I associated with people who had learned to take in every detail without letting anything distract them. She listened to everything I told her, all of it. She didn't interrupt me, didn't write anything down at first, just listened with her hands folded on her desk and her glasses hanging against her chest. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Tell me about the guardianship conversation, she said. I told her again, more slowly. And they've consulted an attorney about this already? That's what she said. Diana picked up her pen. Then we need to move quickly. If they're building a case for incompetency or diminished capacity, they'll be gathering material. Medical records, witnesses, incident documentation. She paused. Have there been any incidents? Anything you could see being characterized as confusion or erratic behavior? I thought about it. I canceled a vendor meeting in September because I had a bad headache. Rescheduled it the same day. Vanessa was in the office when I made the call. That could be used. A headache. In the right framing. She said it without drama, the way you say something that is unpleasant, but simply true. We need a full cognitive evaluation on record from a neurologist of our choosing before they file anything. We need documentation of your competency that predates whatever they're building. All right. We also need every financial record Clara has identified, plus anything further she finds. And we need to discuss security in your home. I looked at her. Security. You're living with people who may be building a legal case against you. I'd like you to think carefully about what you say in that house going forward. About written records. About anything that changes hands. She didn't say the word recording. She didn't need to. I thought about Gerald again. About building something real. About the one thing you never do. I straightened in my chair. Tell me what you need from me, I said, and I'll do it. Diana Reeves looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and picked up her pen, and we began. I drove home from Diana's office in the late afternoon, the October light coming in flat and golden through the windshield. The trees along the highway were turning, red and orange, and the specific deep yellow that always reminded me of the sweater Gerald wore for years, until I finally convinced him to throw it out. He'd laughed and put it on and done a little spin in the kitchen. I had laughed too. I missed him in that moment with the full weight of everything, but not just Gerald the husband, but Gerald the partner, the person who would have sat across from me in Diana Reeves's office and known exactly what to say. The person who had always known what I needed, sometimes before I did. But Gerald was gone. And the company we had built together was being picked apart by the son we had raised together. And the house where Gerald had died, the house where we had spent the best years of our lives, and some of the worst ones too, was occupied by a woman who had moved the coffee mugs and was quietly building a legal argument for why I shouldn't be trusted with my own home. I pulled into the driveway. I sat in the car for a minute. Then I got out and went inside, and I made dinner, and I sat at the table with my son and his wife, and I was pleasant and careful, and I gave away nothing at all. That night, alone in my room, I opened the Notes app on my phone and I started a log. Every conversation, every incident, everything that happened in that house that I needed to remember exactly as it happened, not as I feared I might remember it later. I started with the day they moved in. 43 boxes. And a sense of permanent arrangement. I wrote until midnight. Then I set the phone on the nightstand, in the dark, and I thought about what Gerald used to say when a job went sideways and the clients were difficult and the timeline was falling apart. You build it right, Maggie, or you don't build it at all. There's no in-between. There was no in-between. I closed my eyes. In the morning, there was work to do. The neurologist's name was Dr. Patricia Okafor, and she had an office on the third floor of a medical building that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and old carpet. Diana had recommended her specifically, not just for her credentials, which were considerable, but because she had testified in competency proceedings before and knew how to document her findings in language that held up in court. I drove myself to the appointment. I didn't tell Ryan or Vanessa where I was going. I told them I had a supplier meeting, which was technically true on the same afternoon, just not first. Dr. Okafor was direct in the way I appreciated. No softening, no unnecessary warmth, just precision and respect. She put me through 3 hours of cognitive testing, memory recall, pattern recognition, executive function assessments, verbal processing. She asked me questions about current events, about my personal history, about sequences of numbers and words. She asked me to draw a clock face showing 10 past 11. She asked me to remember a list of 5 words and repeat them back 20 minutes later. I remembered all 5 words. I drew the clock correctly. I answered every question she asked me. At the end, she sat across from me and folded her hands and said, "Mrs. Hayes, based on everything I've observed today, your cognitive function is well within normal parameters for your age. In fact, in several categories, you're performing above average. There is no clinical evidence of dementia, diminished capacity, or any condition that would affect your ability to manage your personal or financial affairs." I exhaled slowly. I hadn't realized how much I'd needed to hear it said out loud by someone with no stake in the outcome. "I'd like a written report," I said, "detailed, with all test results included." "Of course." She paused. "Mrs. Hayes, can I ask, is there a legal matter involved?" "There may be," I said. She nodded, unsurprised. "I'll make sure the documentation is thorough." I thanked her and drove to the supplier meeting, and then drove home in the dark and sat in the driveway again. The engine off, the neighborhood quiet. Through the living room window, I could see the blue flicker of the television. Ryan and Vanessa, settled in like they'd always been there. I went inside. I said goodnight. I went upstairs. I had the report in my hands 4 days later. November came in hard that year, cold early, the kind of cold that arrived before you were ready and stayed longer than you wanted. I kept working. I kept going into the office every morning and running Hayes Construction the way I had run it for the past decade, carefully, seriously, with the full weight of attention it deserved. But I was watching now. I was watching everything. It was Clara who found the second layer of it. She called me on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks into the extended audit she'd been running, and her voice had a flatness to it that I recognized as the sound of someone trying to stay professional while reporting something that made them furious. "I need you to come in," she said. "How bad?" A pause. "It's not just the transfers, Margaret." I was in her office by noon, by meet. The documents she spread across the conference table this time included vendor contracts, 3 of them, each signed in the past 8 months, each directing significant portions of project subcontracting to a company called Crestline Development Services. I had never heard of Crestline Development Services. When Clara ran it through the state business registry, it had been incorporated 14 months ago. The registered agent was a woman named Teresa Mallon. "Do you know who Teresa Mallon is?" Clara asked. "No." Clara turned her laptop to face me. The LinkedIn profile for Teresa Mallon showed a woman in her 40s with a professional headshot and a work history that included, third from the top, 18 months as an office coordinator for a marketing firm in Columbus, the same firm where Vanessa Cole had worked before moving to Ohio. I sat very still. "They went to the same company," I said. "Overlapping by about a year," Clara said. "And Crestline has billed Hayes Construction for $280,000 in subcontracting fees in the past 8 months. I can find no record of the work being performed. The project files don't reference Crestline. The crew logs don't show their workers on any of our sites." She paused. "The contracts were authorized with your signature." My signature again. Yes. I looked at the contracts. The signature was mine, or something that looked enough like mine that it had gotten through our authorization process without anyone questioning it. Which meant Ryan had known exactly how to replicate it. Which meant he had been practicing, or someone had helped him practice, for long enough to get it right. $230,000 in account transfers, $280,000 in fraudulent subcontracting, over $500,000, taken from the company Gerald and I had spent 32 years building. "Clara," I said, "I need you to print everything, every document, every flag, every transaction. I need 2 copies of everything, and I need 1 copy stored somewhere that is not my house or your office." She looked at me steadily. "I have a safety deposit box at First Federal. Use it." She nodded. "I'll have everything ready by Friday." I drove to Diana's office directly from Clara's, and I sat across from her and told her everything. Diana listened with that same focused stillness, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Over $500,000. At minimum. And the forgeries. At minimum." Diana took off her glasses and set them on the desk and rubbed the bridge of her nose. It was the first moment I had seen her do anything that wasn't completely composed, and it frightened me more than anything else had, because it told me that even she, who had seen a great deal in 25 years of this work, found this particular scope of it striking. "They're not just trying to take the company, Margaret," she said. "They're looting it while they make the case that you can't run it. They're creating the problem and the solution at the same time." "I know. We need to move on multiple fronts: forensic accounting, a professional examiner who can authenticate the forgeries, civil fraud filing, and if the competency petition comes before we're ready, we need to be in a position to counter it immediately." She paused. "How are things at the house?" "Managed," I said. "Are you documenting?" "Every day." She looked at me for a moment. "Are you safe there?" It was a question I hadn't expected, and it hit me in a place I hadn't known was exposed. I thought about it honestly. "They want the company in the house," I said. "They don't want to hurt me. Hurting me would make things harder for them." "That's probably accurate," Diana said. "But I want you to be careful. And I want you to let me know immediately if anything changes." I said I would. I drove home in the dark again. The cold had settled in properly by then, frost on the windshield in the mornings, the yard going brown and stiff. The dinner happened on a Friday night in late November. I want to be precise about what happened because I have replayed it so many times since that the memory has the quality of something I've watched rather than lived. But I was there, in my dining room, at my table, and I was completely present for every word of it. Vanessa had cooked. She did that sometimes with the particular pointed generosity of someone who wants you to feel obligated before they ask for something. She'd made a roast and roasted vegetables and a salad with a dressing she'd clearly prepared from scratch. The table was set nicely. There was wine. We ate for a while. Small talk. A project Ryan was supervising, something Vanessa had read, the weather. And then, with a casualness so practiced it was almost invisible, Vanessa said, "We've been talking to Tom Hendricks." Tom Hendricks was an attorney, estate law primarily. I knew him by reputation. "Have you?" I said. "Just exploring some options," she said. "Nothing formal. But he did mention that given the size of the company's assets and given, she paused, chose her next words with care, given the things we've noticed lately, it might be in everyone's interest to begin a formal capacity evaluation. Through the courts, just to have it on record. Ryan was looking at his plate. What things, I said, have you noticed? Vanessa set down her fork. Margaret, the canceled meetings, the confusion with the Deering contract last month. I didn't confuse anything with the Deering contract. I renegotiated it. The terms were bad. You renegotiated it without informing Ryan. Ryan is not my co-owner. Ryan is an employee of Hayes Construction. The word landed hard. I had not said it quite that plainly before, and I felt Ryan flinch at the end of the table even though I wasn't looking at him. Vanessa's expression didn't change. That was the thing about her. She was extraordinarily difficult to rattle because she had already decided what she was going to say before she sat down. We're worried about you, she said. That's all. No, I said. You're not worried about me. You're worried about what happens to the money and the house and the company if I stay in control of them. Those are different concerns. Let's not confuse them. Silence. Ryan put down his fork. Mom, don't. My voice was still quiet. I was still somehow quiet. Don't sit there and let her do this, and then say my name like I'm the problem. I'm not saying you're the problem. You've been draining money from my company, Ryan. The words dropped into the room like something thrown from a height. They hit, and the room absorbed them, and there was a moment, a specific crystalline moment, where Ryan's face did something I had never seen it do before. Not guilt exactly. Something worse than guilt. Something that looked like the decision not to feel it. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Yes, you do. Margaret, Vanessa began. I'm speaking to my son. I turned to look at Ryan directly. $230,000 in unauthorized transfers. Your accounts. My signature, which you forged. And a subcontracting company called Crestline Development Services that has billed Hayes Construction for work that was never performed. Work authorized by contracts that also bear my forged signature. And Crestline's registered agent is a woman who used to work with your wife. Ryan's jaw had gone tight. He was very still. I want you both out of this house, I said. Not immediately. I understand we need a transition period, but I want a timeline, and I want it in writing, and I want it soon. Vanessa leaned forward. And here's the moment I want you to understand, because this is when I finally saw exactly what she was, stripped of all the composure and the leather portfolios and the carefully chosen words. If you pursue this, she said quietly, evenly, we will file the competency petition immediately. We have a physician who has already prepared a report. We have 3 witnesses who will testify to incidents of confusion and erratic behavior. We have documentation. She paused. You will spend the next 2 years fighting to prove you're not losing your mind while we manage the company on your behalf. And by the time it's over, there won't be much left to fight over. She said it like a business proposition, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. I looked at her. I looked at my son, who was sitting in the chair where Gerald used to sit, in the house Gerald helped me buy, and he was not looking at me. Okay, I said. I stood up. I picked up my plate and my wine glass and I carried them to the kitchen. I rinsed the plate. I finished the wine standing at the sink, looking out the window at the dark yard, at the frost on the grass, at the bare arms of the trees Gerald and I had planted the spring after we moved in. They were still at the table. I could feel the silence from them, the recalculation, the trying to understand what okay had meant. I went upstairs, I called Diana Reeves, even though it was 9:30 on a Friday night. She picked up on the second ring. They threatened me, I said. Directly, they have a physician and they have witnesses. Tell me everything. I told her everything. She was quiet while I talked, and then she said, All right, this accelerates our timeline. I need you to do something for me tonight. What? Write down everything that was said at that table. Word for word, as close as you can get. Time and date it. Send it to me. All right. And Margaret, the recording device we discussed. Have you? Yes, I said. Starting now, she said. Every conversation in that house. I hung up and sat down at my desk, and I wrote out the dinner conversation from memory. Every word I could hold on to, the exact phrasing Vanessa had used. We have a physician. We have 3 witnesses. I wrote it all down and sent it to Diana, and then I opened the drawer of my nightstand and I looked at the small digital recorder I'd bought 3 weeks earlier and placed there without yet using. I thought about what Gerald would say. I thought about what he wouldn't say. Wouldn't offer comfort exactly. Wouldn't tell me it was going to be all right because he never made promises he wasn't certain he could keep. He would say, "You know what you have to do, so do it." I picked up the recorder. I checked the battery. I set it on my nightstand where I would remember it in the morning. Then I lay back on my bed and stared at the ceiling, and I thought about my son at that table, not looking at me, while his wife explained how they planned to take everything I had. I had loved that boy with every available part of myself. I had worked for him before he was born and kept working after he became a man and held on to the company through Gerald's death, partly because I genuinely believed, that one day I would hand it to Ryan and he would carry what his father and I had built forward into something we couldn't yet imagine. That belief had not died easily. I want to be honest about that. Even sitting there in the dark with the recording device on my nightstand and Diana Reeves's number in my recent calls and Claire's audit in a safety deposit box at First Federal, some part of me was still in grief for the version of Ryan Hayes I had raised and apparently lost before I understood he was gone. But grief, I had learned, was not a reason to stop moving. I had buried Gerald. I had kept the company alive. I had sat across from a woman who wanted everything I had, and I had not shown her my hands. I was not done. December moved through the house like something cold and deliberate. Ryan and Vanessa operated with a surface-level normalcy that I recognized as performance, pleasantries at breakfast, careful neutral topics at dinner, a mutual agreement to behave as though the Friday conversation had not happened. But the pressure was there beneath it, constant and increasing, the way weather systems build before you can see them. Ryan began coming home from the office with files, not unusual in itself. He'd always worked evenings, but these files were from the archive room, the older records, and when I checked the sign-out log in the records office, several folders had been removed and not returned, files going back 5, 7, 10 years. Project records, client contracts, early financial documents. I had copies of the most important ones already. Diana had been thorough about that, but the fact of their removal told me they were building something, looking for inconsistencies, for anything they could characterize as mismanagement or error, or the kind of confusion an incompetent woman might produce. They were mining the history of what Gerald and I had built, looking for the cracks they could pry open. Vanessa, I noticed, had begun making phone calls from the back patio in the cold, wrapped in her coat, where I couldn't hear her from inside the house. I saw her out there 3, 4, 5 times. She'd come back in flushed from the cold and perfectly composed and say nothing about who she'd been speaking to. One evening, I came downstairs for water at 11 o'clock and found her at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a document pulled up. I could see it clearly from the doorway before she heard me and closed the screen. It was a form. I caught only the header, but it was enough. Petition for appointment of guardian, probate division. They were already drafting it. I went back upstairs without getting the water. I sat on the edge of my bed. I pressed my hands flat on my knees. I thought about the report in Dr. Okafor's files. I thought about the safety deposit box. I thought about Diana Reeves, who had been in this business for 25 years and who had looked at what Ryan and Vanessa were building and called it what it was. I thought about the recording device on my nightstand. 3 weeks of conversations, carefully kept. Dinners and hallways, and the occasional moment when one of them said something in my presence that they would not have said if they'd known I was building a case. They thought I was a confused old woman who could be maneuvered out of her own life. They had been living in my house, eating at my table for 7 months. And not once, had either of them stopped to consider that the woman who had kept a company alive through her husband's death and a decade of hard years might know, better than most, how to survive being underestimated. That was their first mistake. It wasn't their last. The petition arrived on a Tuesday morning in January. A process server rang the doorbell at 8:45 while I was drinking my first cup of coffee and reading the overnight emails from our project foreman in Dayton. I opened the door and he handed me the envelope with the particular practice neutrality of someone who does an uncomfortable job and has learned not to make eye contact. I thanked him. I closed the door. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter and finished my coffee before I opened it. I had known it was coming. Diana had warned me it was coming. I had documents ready, a physician's report ready, an accountant's audit ready, months of recorded conversations archived on a hard drive in Diana's office. I had known. It still hit me like a fist in the chest. In the matter of the guardianship of Margaret Ann Hayes, and then my name printed on a legal document, positioned as someone who needed to be managed, someone who could not be trusted to manage herself. My name, in a petition filed by my son. I read the whole thing standing at the kitchen counter. Ryan was still upstairs. Vanessa had left early, her car gone from the driveway before I came down. I read every paragraph of the document they had built against me. The physician's report, attached as Exhibit A, from a Dr. Leonard Marsh, who had apparently conducted an evaluation and concluded that I demonstrated significant markers of cognitive decline consistent with early-stage dementia. I had never met Dr. Leonard Marsh. I had never been in his office. I had never sat across from him and drawn a clock face or repeated a list of words. They had manufactured a medical report from a physician I had never seen. I put the document down on the counter. I breathed in slowly. I picked up my phone and called Diana. "I have it," I said when she answered. "I know. The court sent me a copy this morning. Are you all right?" "I'm reading the physician's report. I've never met this man." "I know." Her voice was very steady. "Margaret, this is actually significant. A fabricated medical report is not just unethical. It's criminal. Document fraud, potentially fraud on the court. This changes the landscape of what we're dealing with." A pause. "Can you come in this afternoon?" "I'll be there at 2. I set the phone down. I heard Ryan's footsteps on the stairs, the particular creak of the third step from the bottom, the one I had been meaning to have fixed for years. He came into the kitchen in yesterday's clothes, hair uncombed, and he saw the document on the counter, and he stopped. For a moment, we just looked at each other. "Mom," he started. "Don't," I said. "I don't want to hear it this morning." He opened his mouth again. Something crossed his face, something that might have been the beginning of something honest, and then it closed down. He went to the refrigerator, took out the orange juice, poured a glass. "We're doing this because we're worried about you," he said to the refrigerator door. "You're doing this because Vanessa told you to," I said. "And you've been doing what Vanessa tells you for long enough that you've stopped noticing the difference between her conclusions and your own." He didn't answer. He drank his juice. He left the kitchen without looking at me. I picked up the petition and put it in my bag. I went to work. I ran the morning meeting, reviewed 3 project budgets, signed off on a materials order for a commercial renovation in Westerville. I did my job. I did it well. I did not think about the petition until I was sitting across from Diana at 2 o'clock, and then I thought about nothing else. Diana's strategy had been building for months, but the petition gave us a date. The hearing was set for late February, 6 weeks out, and that date gave everything a new weight and urgency. She laid it all out for me in the afternoon light of her conference room, speaking precisely and without softening. The forensic document examiner she'd retained, a man named Robert Callahan, who had spent 20 years with the FBI's Questioned Documents Unit, had completed his analysis of the forged signatures on the account transfers and the Crestline contracts. His findings were definitive. The signatures were not mine. The pen pressure, the letter formation, the baseline angle, all measurably inconsistent with my genuine signature samples. He had a 60-page report and he was prepared to testify to every page of it. Clara had completed her full audit. The total amount moved through unauthorized channels from Hayes Construction over a 22-month period was $647,000. The Crestline connection to Vanessa's former colleague, Teresa Mallon, was documented, and a private investigator Diana had quietly retained had established that Teresa Mallon and Vanessa had maintained regular contact throughout the period in question. Phone records, a paper trail of lunches, one documented meeting at a downtown hotel 3 weeks before the first Crestline invoice was submitted to Hayes Construction. And the recordings. I had been careful, I had been patient, and I had gathered 4 months of conversations in that house. Dinners, hallway exchanges, 2 phone calls Vanessa had made from the kitchen late at night when she apparently believed I was asleep. The calls were to someone she addressed only as Tom Hendricks, the estate attorney, as Diana confirmed, and in those calls Vanessa spoke with a frankness she never used in my presence. She discussed the petition timeline. She discussed the physician's report, referring to Leonard Marsh by first name with a familiarity that made it clear she had arranged his involvement personally. She used the phrase "before she figures out what we're doing" in reference to me, in a call made from my own kitchen on a Tuesday night in December. That recording alone, Diana said, setting down the transcript, establishes consciousness of guilt. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She was managing the timeline to stay ahead of you. She paused. They're going to walk into that courtroom in 6 weeks believing they have a confused elderly woman who stumbled onto some financial irregularities she doesn't fully understand. We need to let them believe that until the moment we don't. I understood what she was saying. You want me to do nothing between now and the hearing. I want you to do nothing visible. Nothing that signals to them how prepared we are. Can you manage that? I thought about living in that house for 6 more weeks, eating at that table, saying good morning and good night to the 2 people who had been dismantling my life from the inside for the better part of a year. Yes, I said. It won't be comfortable. I've done uncomfortable things before. Diana almost smiled. I know you have. Han, those 6 weeks were the longest of my life. Longer than the first weeks after Gerald died, longer than the year I ran the company alone and wasn't sure it was going to survive. Those earlier hard things had been hard because they were losses. This was hard in a different way. It required me to hold everything I knew and show none of it, to perform a version of myself that was worried but not fighting back, rattled but not organized, the confused aging woman they believed me to be. I am not a natural performer. I had always been direct. It was something Gerald loved about me, and something that had made certain negotiations harder than they needed to be over the years. I said what I meant. I showed what I felt. For 6 weeks I did neither. I let Vanessa make observations about my memory lapses at dinner, and I let them land without challenge. I let Ryan handle 2 vendor calls that were properly my responsibility, and I watched him do it imperfectly and said nothing. I let the house feel like their house, and I let them feel like they were winning, and I went to my room every night and wrote in my log and called Diana twice a week and counted the days. 2 things happened during those 6 weeks that I have not been able to fully account for in my memory, even now. The first was a Sunday afternoon when Ryan and I were briefly alone. Vanessa had gone to see a friend and wouldn't be back until evening. We were in the kitchen, both of us making separate versions of lunch without discussing it, and Ryan said suddenly with his back to me, "Do you remember when I was in 8th grade and I broke the basement window?" I stopped. "The baseball," I said. "You'd been told 100 times not to practice near the house." "I hid in the yard for 2 hours because I was scared of what Dad would say." He paused. He didn't even yell. He just looked at me and said, "Okay, now go get the broom." I didn't say anything. "I keep thinking about that," Ryan said. He didn't say anything else. He took his plate and went to the living room and turned on the television, and I stood in the kitchen and I felt for a moment the specific ache of loving someone who is choosing wrong. Not the clean anger of betrayal, but something murkier and harder. The grief of watching a person you know to be capable of better things refuse to be better. I wanted to believe that moment was the beginning of something. I know better now than to say for certain what it was. People are complicated. Ryan Hayes was complicated. He was a man who had made choices I couldn't forgive and felt things he couldn't act on. And both of those things were simultaneously true, and the truth of one did not cancel the other. The second thing was the Friday before the hearing, when I came home from the office to find 2 people I didn't recognize leaving through my front door. A man and a woman, both middle-aged, both well-dressed, both carrying themselves with the particular careful posture of people who know they're doing something they'd rather not be observed doing. They were in my house. Vanessa was at the door seeing them out. When she saw me coming up the front walk, her expression shifted. Not dramatically, just the slightest recalibration, the eyes going neutral. And she said, "Margaret, you're home early." "Who were those people?" I asked. "Friends," she said. She stepped back and let me in and offered nothing further, and I went upstairs and called Diana and described both of them in as much detail as I could. Height, approximate age, what they were wearing. Diana called me back 2 hours later. "The woman is a former colleague of Vanessa's from Columbus. The man I'm still working on, but I think he may be one of the witnesses they're planning to call." She paused. "They were likely coaching them. Final preparation before the hearing." "In my house," I said. "In your house." "A beat." Margaret, 6 more days. 6 more days. The courtroom was on the 4th floor of the county courthouse, a room with high ceilings and fluorescent lighting and wooden benches that had absorbed decades of difficult days. I had been in courtrooms before on contract disputes, one zoning appeal in the company's early years, but I had never been in one as a subject, as the person under examination. I sat beside Diana at the respondent's table, and I kept my hands still in my lap, and I looked at the room with the same attention I had given every hard situation in the past year. The judge was a man named Howard Carlyle, 60, measured, with the expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what families did to one another. Ryan and Vanessa sat at the petitioner's table with Tom Hendricks and a second attorney I didn't recognize. Vanessa was dressed conservatively, dark navy, minimal jewelry. Ryan was in a suit I'd given him money to buy for a client meeting 2 years ago. He was not looking at me. Tom Hendricks opened by painting the picture they had built, a portrait of a grieving widow in cognitive decline, a woman who had been making increasingly erratic business decisions, who had shown alarming episodes of confusion and memory loss, who, with great reluctance and out of genuine love and concern, her son and daughter-in-law were seeking to protect through the mechanism of guardianship. He was smooth, he was credible. He cited the Marsh report. He outlined the testimony they would present. I sat and listened, and I breathed slowly, and I showed the room nothing. The first witness was the woman from my house, the former Columbus colleague, whose name turned out to be Barbara Fielding. She testified that she had visited Hayes Construction 3 months prior and witnessed me becoming confused and agitated during a routine conversation about project timelines, that I had apparently lost track of which project she was referring to and had repeated myself twice without appearing to notice. It was entirely fabricated. Barbara Fielding had never been to Hayes Construction. I had never met her before she walked out of my house 5 days ago. The second witness was a man named David Carver, who claimed to be a longtime vendor of Hayes Construction and testified that I had called him in September to dispute an invoice that had already been paid, that I had been confused and difficult to reason with, that he had come away from the conversation genuinely worried about my mental state. David Carver was, in fact, the husband of Teresa Mallon, the registered agent of Crestline Development Services. Clara had found it. Diana had confirmed it. The man testifying about my confusion was married to the woman who had helped Vanessa steal $647,000 from my company. I did not react. I kept my hands still. I watched Vanessa at her table, composed and attentive, and I thought about the phone call she'd made from my kitchen in December, before she figures out what we're doing. I had figured it out. I had been figuring it out for months, and I had waited and been careful, and now I was here. Tom Hendricks submitted the Marsh report as evidence with the practiced confidence of someone presenting a decisive document. He spoke about it at some length. Dr. Marsh's credentials, the methodology of his evaluation, his conclusions regarding early-stage dementia, and the attendant risks to Ms. Hayes' ability to manage significant financial and personal affairs. Judge Carlyle examined the report. He asked several clarifying questions about the evaluation process. Hendricks answered smoothly. Then Diana stood up. She stood up the way people stand up when they have been sitting with something for a long time and are finally ready to put it on the table. Unhurried, completely certain. "Your Honor," she said, "the respondent would like to enter several items into evidence." The first was Dr. Okafor's report. The full cognitive evaluation, conducted 4 months ago, concluding that my cognitive function was well within normal parameters, above average in several categories, with no clinical indication of dementia or diminished capacity. Judge Carlyle read it carefully. He looked at the Marsh report. He looked at the Okafor report. "Counsel," he said to Hendricks, "these 2 reports reach dramatically different conclusions. The respondent's report was obtained after the fact, in anticipation of litigation," Hendricks began. "The petitioner's report was obtained by a physician who has never met my client," Diana said. "We have documentation establishing that Dr. Leonard Marsh has had no contact with Margaret Hayes. His report describes an evaluation that did not occur. We are prepared to submit documentation of this to the court and, if necessary, to the State Medical Licensing Board." The room shifted. I felt it. The particular quality of attention in a space when something has just changed. Hendricks said something about Dr. Marsh's credibility. Diana set a document on the clerk's desk. It was a record of Leonard Marsh's professional history, including 2 previous complaints filed against him for issuing evaluations of individuals he had not examined. He had surrendered his hospital privileges in 2 counties. He was, as Diana said, calmly and without emphasis, a physician who can be hired to say what someone needs said. She moved to the financial records. Claire's complete audit, Robert Callahan's forensic document report, the incorporation records for Crestline Development Services, the phone records establishing Vanessa's contact with Teresa Mallon, and the fact, now formally documented, that David Carver, who had testified 20 minutes ago about my supposed cognitive confusion, was Teresa Mallon's husband. Tom Hendricks objected. Judge Carlisle overruled him. And then Diana said, "Your Honor, we would also like to submit audio recordings." I watched Vanessa's face when Diana said it. I'd been waiting for that moment, I realized, for a long time. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with the deep and complicated feeling of someone who has been called a liar and is finally going to be believed. The first recording was from a dinner conversation in November. Vanessa's voice, clear and level, explaining their plan to file the petition, referencing the physician and the witnesses, using the phrase, "We're protected as long as she doesn't move first." The second was the kitchen phone call from December. Diana played 30 seconds of it. Vanessa's voice, unhurried, domestic, saying, "Marsh has the report ready, Tom. We just need a few more weeks before she figures out what we're doing." The courtroom was very quiet. Hendricks attempted a rapid recovery, challenged the admissibility of the recordings, raised the question of whether they had been legally obtained. Diana had anticipated this. Ohio's recording law required one-party consent, and I was a party to the conversations recorded in my own home. She had a brief filed on the question before he finished asking it. Judge Carlisle called a 15-minute recess. I sat at the respondent's table and looked at my hands and breathed. Diana sat beside me and said nothing, which was exactly right. There was nothing to say. It was in the room now. All of it, everything I had collected and carried for months. And the room was doing with it what rooms do. Ryan had turned in his chair. He was looking at me. Not the way he'd looked at me across the dinner table all those months. Not the careful avoidance, not the studied neutrality. He was looking at me the way the boy in my kitchen had looked at me when he talked about the broken basement window. Like someone who had just fully understood the distance between where they were and where they should have been. I looked back at him. I didn't look away. I didn't look away, and I didn't smile, and I didn't reach for him, and I didn't cry. I looked at my son, this man I had carried and raised and loved and lost, and I let him see that I was still standing, that I had always been standing, that every single thing they had tried to do to me had failed to make me fall. Vanessa was not looking at anyone. She was looking at the table in front of her with the focused attention of someone doing rapid calculations. The composure was still there, the surface of it, anyway. But something underneath it had broken its footing, and I could see it in the set of her jaw, the way her hands were flat on the table, pressing down. The recess ended. Judge Carlisle returned to the bench. He looked at both tables for a moment before he spoke. He had the expression of a man who had seen a great deal in this room over many years and had arrived at a conclusion he found both necessary and grim. "We'll resume," he said, "and I have some questions for petitioner's counsel." Diana touched my arm lightly under the table, just briefly. I kept my hands still. I kept my face still, and I waited for what came next. Judge Carlisle's questions were not gentle. He directed them at Tom Hendricks with the measured precision of someone who has spent decades distinguishing between people who don't know they're wrong and people who have decided it doesn't matter. He asked about the methodology used to select Dr. Marsh. He asked why the evaluation had not been conducted through the court's own appointed examiner, which was standard practice in contested guardianship proceedings. He asked, with particular quietness, how petitioner's counsel had satisfied himself that the medical report submitted as Exhibit A reflected an actual clinical encounter. Hendricks said that he had relied on his client's representations, that he had no reason to doubt the veracity of the physician's findings, that he had acted in good faith. Diana did not visibly react to any of this. She sat beside me with her legal pad and her pen and the particular stillness of someone who had already said what needed to be said and understood that the room was now doing the rest of the work. Judge Carlisle looked at Hendricks for a long moment after his last answer. Then he looked down at the documents in front of him. Then he said, "We'll take a full recess until tomorrow morning at 9. I want both parties prepared to address the admissibility questions I'll be circulating this afternoon, and I want petitioner's counsel to consider carefully what representations he is in a position to continue making to this court." It wasn't a ruling, not yet, but it was something. It was the sound of the floor shifting under the structure Ryan and Vanessa had built, the specific creak that comes before a thing gives way. We filed out of the courtroom into the corridor, and I sat on a wooden bench against the wall while Diana spoke quietly with her paralegal. And I watched Ryan and Vanessa 20 feet away, Hendricks between them, all three speaking in urgent low tones. Vanessa had her arms crossed and her chin up, and she was talking fast. Ryan was listening with his head down, the way he used to listen when he knew he was wrong as a child and hadn't worked out yet how to admit it. I watched my son stand in that corridor and listen to the woman who had orchestrated all of this. And I thought about something Clara had said to me once early in the audit when I'd asked her how people convinced themselves that what they were doing was all right. Clara had looked at me over her glasses and said, "Usually somebody convinces them first. And by the time they figure out they've been convinced, they're too far in to turn around." I didn't know how far in Ryan had been from the beginning. I didn't know how much of this was his design and how much of it he'd been walked into. That uncertainty had lived in me for a long time, like a splinter that's too deep to reach. Not quite pain, but never quite comfortable either. Diana came and sat beside me. "How are you doing?" "I'm all right," I said, and I meant it, mostly. "Tomorrow will be harder," she said. "Carlisle is going to push petitioner's counsel on the record. Hendricks is going to have to make a choice about how much exposure he's willing to take on for clients who have been lying to him. That could go a few different ways." "What's the best way it goes?" "Hendricks withdraws from the petition. Carlisle dismisses it with prejudice and refers the financial matter to the DA's office." She paused. "The worst way is Hendricks digs in and we spend another day establishing the same things we established today in more detail." "And the most likely way?" She considered this. "Somewhere in between," she said. "But Margaret, I want you to understand, regardless of how tomorrow unfacts, the financial case is solid. The forgeries are documented, the fraud is documented, the recording of Vanessa explicitly discussing the scheme is documented. Even if the guardianship petition somehow survived tomorrow, which I don't believe it will, the criminal exposure for both of them is significant, and it does not depend on the outcome in that courtroom." I let that settle. "Okay," I said. "Go home tonight. Eat something. Sleep if you can." "They'll be there," I said. "I know." A pause. "Do you want me to arrange somewhere else for you to stay?" I thought about it. I thought about leaving my own house the night before the day that mattered most. I thought about what that would mean, what it would feel like, and what Gerald would think of it. "No," I said. "I'll be there." The house was very quiet when I got home. Vanessa's car was in the driveway, but I didn't see her, didn't hear her. Ryan was in the kitchen when I came in, standing at the counter with a glass of water, not doing anything with it, just standing there the way people stand when they've been trying to decide something for a while. He looked at me when I came in. I set my bag on the chair by the door and took off my coat. "I didn't know about Marsh," he said. I looked at him. "The doctor," he said. "I didn't know she'd arranged a fake report. She told me we had a physician who'd reviewed your records. I thought—" He stopped, pressed his hand flat on the counter. "I thought it was real." I stood in my hallway and looked at my son, and I tried to take that statement at its honest weight without adding to it or subtracting from it. "Ryan," I said carefully, "did you know about Crestline?" A long pause. "Yes." "Did you know the signatures on those contracts were forged?" Another pause, smaller. "I signed some of them myself," he said. "She told me it was a restructuring mechanism, that it was legal." "It wasn't legal." "I know that now." "You knew it then," I said. Not unkindly, just as fact. "You knew your mother's name was on contracts she didn't sign. You knew money was leaving the company in ways that weren't authorized. You're not a foolish man, Ryan. You knew." He didn't argue with that. He looked at the water glass. "I don't know what she told you," I said. "I don't know what she convinced you was true or fair or owed, but I need you to understand that what you did, what you participated in, was not a gray area. It was not a misunderstanding. You took money from the company your father and I built, and you helped someone try to have me declared incompetent so you could take the rest. I paused. Whatever she told you, those were the actions. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice that was stripped of everything, all the performance, all the careful management, I know. That was the truest thing he said to me in that house. 2 words, and they cost him something real. I could see it. But 2 true words at the end of a long wrong don't undo the wrong. I had learned that lesson in the other direction when I was young, and it had stayed with me. Get a lawyer, I said. Your own lawyer, not Hendricks, not anyone Vanessa found. Someone who is working for you and not the 2 of you together. I picked up my bag. Whatever happens tomorrow, you're going to need someone in your corner who is actually in your corner. I went upstairs. I heard him still standing in the kitchen for a long time after. The morning of the second hearing day was gray and cold, the kind of February morning that feels like the world is withholding something. I dressed carefully. I ate toast and drank coffee and drove to the courthouse and sat in Diana's car in the parking garage for 5 minutes while she went through her notes one more time, not because she needed to, but because it was her process and I had learned to respect it. Ready? She said. Yes, I said. Tom Hendricks, it turned out, had spent the night making a choice. He appeared in the courtroom that morning looking like a man who had slept badly and arrived at an unpleasant destination. He requested permission to address the court before proceedings resumed. Judge Carlisle granted it. Hendricks stood at the podium and said, with the measured and clearly pre-rehearsed language of an attorney managing his own liability, that petitioner's counsel had become aware of information that materially undermined the evidentiary basis of the guardianship petition. The counsel could not in good conscience continue to present certain evidence to the court, and that petitioner's counsel was withdrawing his representation effective immediately and recommending that the petition be voluntarily dismissed. The room absorbed that. Vanessa, at the petitioner's table, now flanked only by the second attorney and Ryan, who had appeared that morning with a different lawyer, a younger man named Greg Alton, whom I didn't know, sat very still. Her face did not change, but something in her posture changed, a fraction, a degree. The particular shift of someone who has just lost a variable they were counting on. Judge Carlisle accepted Hendricks' withdrawal and noted it on the record. He then looked at the petitioner's table and said, given the withdrawal of lead counsel and the significant evidentiary questions raised during yesterday's proceedings, this court is dismissing the petition for guardianship of Margaret Ann Hayes with prejudice. Mrs. Hayes is declared fully competent and retains complete legal authority over her personal and financial affairs, with prejudice. Those 2 words meant it could not be refiled. It was done. Diana wrote something on her legal pad and slid it to me. It said, first part, stay steady. I stayed steady, because the judge wasn't finished. He looked at both tables with the expression of a man who has seen a deliberate wrong done in his courtroom and intends to say so clearly. This court is referring the matters of document fraud, fabrication of medical testimony, and financial misappropriation detailed in respondent's evidence to the district attorney's office for review. I am also referring the conduct of Dr. Leonard Marsh to the State Medical Licensing Board. Also eat that state samsumesmeet. He paused. This proceeding has revealed conduct that goes substantially beyond a family disagreement about an elder's capacity. The court takes fraud on this court seriously. The relevant authorities will be receiving this court's complete record. Ryan had gone pale. Vanessa had not changed expression, but her second attorney leaned over and spoke quietly in her ear, and she closed her eyes for just a moment, the first crack in the surface, the first thing that looked like what it actually was. And then it was over. Not everything, not the criminal referrals, not the civil suit Diana had ready to file that same afternoon, not the full accounting of what was owed and what would be returned, but the thing they had built to take from me, the petition that had my name on it as a subject, as someone to be managed and controlled and stripped of her own life. That was over. I walked out of that courtroom into the corridor, and I stood by the window at the end of the hall, and I looked out at the gray February sky, and I breathed. Diana filed the civil fraud suit that afternoon. I was not present for it. I had gone back to the office, because there was work to do, and the work didn't stop, had never stopped. I sat at my desk and returned 3 calls and reviewed a project proposal, and somewhere in the middle of reading a materials estimate, I realized my hands had stopped shaking. I hadn't known they were shaking until they weren't. The civil suit was comprehensive. It named Ryan Hayes and Vanessa Cole as defendants, sought recovery of the $647,000 in documented misappropriation plus damages, and included a separate action related to the fraudulent medical report and the manufactured witnesses, tortious fraud, intentional infliction of harm. Diana was not a timid attorney. She had not been timid once in all the months I'd worked with her. The criminal referral moved faster than I expected. The district attorney's office contacted Diana within a week of the hearing. They had been tracking a pattern of elder financial abuse cases, and the documentation from our case, the forensic report, the Crestline paper trail, the recordings, was, according to the investigator assigned, unusually complete. That was Clara's work. That was months of careful, unglamorous accounting done by a woman who had been my accountant for 16 years and who had, in the end, helped me save everything. I called Clara the evening I heard from Diana about the DA's office. She picked up on the third ring, and I said, "I don't think I've told you properly what you did for me." "You told me to pull everything," she said, "so I pulled everything." Clara. Margaret. Her voice was warm and a little gruff, the way it always was when she was deflecting something. "You paid your invoices on time for 16 years. That's all the thanks I need." I laughed. It came out rougher than I expected, catching in my throat, and I pressed my hand against my mouth for a moment because the laugh was close to something else, and I needed to keep them separate. "Thank you," I said again, and I meant the full weight of it. Charsak. The eviction, I will call it what it was, happened on a Saturday morning in March. Diana had obtained an order requiring Ryan and Vanessa to vacate the property within 30 days of the civil suit filing. They had 30 days. They took 23. I was at the office when it happened. I had arranged to be at the office. I did not want to watch them carry boxes out of my house, did not want to stand in the rooms where Gerald and I had spent our lives and watch the remnants of their occupation being loaded into a moving truck. I thought that was a thing I could spare myself, and I was right to. When I came home that evening, the house was empty in a specific way. Not the empty of a house no one lives in, but the empty of a house returned to itself. Some of their things were gone. Some marks remained. A scuff on the hallway wall, a different arrangement of the spice cabinet that I hadn't bothered to undo. The faint impression in the carpet where a piece of furniture had stood. Evidence of occupancy. I would deal with it gradually, over time, the way you deal with most things. I went through each room slowly. The kitchen. The dining room with its long table. The living room where the television sat and where I could still see, if I looked at the right angle. The chair where Gerald used to read on Sunday mornings, with his coffee going cold beside him because he always forgot it was there. I sat in that chair. I had not sat in it since Gerald died. It had been Ryan's chair for a while, and then it had been nobody's, pushed back against the wall out of the way. I sat in it and looked at the room and let myself feel the full size of the year that had just passed. All of it. The fear, the anger, the grief, the 6 weeks of enforced performance, the courtroom, Diana's legal pad sliding across the table with "Stay Steady" written on it. My phone buzzed. A text from Diana. D. A confirmed charges filed. Ryan and Vanessa both named. Arraignment scheduled. I set the phone face down on my knee. Charges. Arraignment. My son, facing criminal charges for what he had done inside this company and this house and this family. I want to be honest about how that felt, because I think people expect it to feel like victory. And it didn't feel exactly like that. Victory is clean. This was not clean. This was the particular grief of justice in a situation where justice cannot give you back what was lost, cannot give you back the version of Ryan that the 8th grade boy in the yard had the potential to become, cannot give you back the years, cannot give you back the uncomplicated belief that the people you love are safe to love without conditions. I sat in Gerald's chair in my empty, returned house, and I let myself feel all of it. The relief and the grief and the anger and the exhaustion and the small, persistent thread of love for my son that I didn't know what to do with and suspected I never would. I was not a woman who had won. I was a woman who had not lost. Those are different things, And anyone who tells you they're the same has never been made to fight for something that should never have been taken from them in the first place. I sat there until it got dark. Then I got up and I turned on the lights and I went to the kitchen and made myself dinner, real dinner, something that took time because I could take time now because it was my kitchen and my time and there was no performance required of me in this house anymore. The charges against Ryan included fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. The charges against Vanessa included all of those and added witness tampering. The coaching of Barbara Fielding and David Carver, documented by the private investigators' observations outside my house in the days before the hearing, was enough to establish it. Teresa Mallon, Crestline's registered agent, had cooperated with the DA's office in exchange for a reduced charge. She had provided phone records, emails, and a detailed account of how the scheme had been structured. Her cooperation, Diana told me, had significantly strengthened the case against Vanessa in particular. I thought about what that meant. About the fact that the network Vanessa had built to take from me had piece by piece come apart, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the slow accumulation of documentation, of evidence, of the truth being more durable than the structure built to contain it. They had counted on my confusion. They had counted on my isolation. They had counted on the fact that I was an older woman who had recently lost her husband and could be characterized as fragile. They had made a fundamental error in judgment, because the thing that had kept Hayes Construction alive through Gerald's death, through bad contracts and difficult years, and the ordinary hard work of 32 years, that thing lived in me, not in the company's name or the company's assets or the building where we'd worked all those years. It lived in me, and they had never really looked at me closely enough to see it. Outside, the March wind moved through the trees Gerald and I had planted. They were starting to bud, barely, just the faintest suggestion of green at the tips of the branches, the way early spring always arrives in Ohio, hesitant and provisional before it becomes certain. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at them. I had work to do tomorrow. There was always work to do. The company was still standing, still running, still carrying the name Gerald, and I had put on it 32 years ago in a one-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner's with a second-hand truck and a set of inherited tools and the absolute, unshakable belief that something real could be built. It had been real. It still was. And I was still the one who ran it. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in Ohio when winter is overstayed. Reluctant, provisional, arriving a little at a time rather than all at once. The trees in my yard put out their buds in March, and the grass came back in April, and by May the whole yard looked the way it always had, the way it looked every year when Gerald was alive, green and ordinary and completely indifferent to everything that had happened inside the house behind it. I found that comforting, somehow, the indifference of it, the fact that the yard did not know what it had witnessed. The trial, Ryan and Vanessa's criminal trial, was set for September. Between March and September, I rebuilt. That is the word I keep coming back to, and I want to be precise about what it means, because rebuilding after something like this is not the clean, cinematic process people imagine when they use that word. It is not a montage. It is not a series of triumphant mornings where you wake up feeling stronger. It is slow and uneven, and there are days in the middle of it that feel indistinguishable from the worst days of the thing you're supposed to be recovering from. There was a Tuesday in April, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, warm enough to open the windows, work going well, nothing specifically wrong. When I sat at my desk at Hayes Construction and looked at the framed photograph on the wall, the one from the company's 25th anniversary, Gerald and me and a dozen employees standing in front of the first commercial building we'd ever put our name on, and I could not stop crying for 20 minutes. Not a dignified cry. An ugly, thorough, exhausting one that came from somewhere I hadn't known was still that full. My assistant, a young woman named Priya, who had been with us for 3 years, knocked on my closed office door and asked if I needed anything. I said I was fine, and could she give me a few minutes? She said of course, and went away and came back 12 minutes later with a cup of tea she'd made the way I liked it, which I had apparently mentioned once in passing, and she had remembered, and she set it on my desk without a word and went back to her own office. Small kindnesses. They matter more than people know. I drank the tea, I washed my face in the small bathroom off my office. I went back to work. That is what rebuilding looks like most of the time. You cry and you wash your face and you go back to work. The civil suit settled in June. Ryan did not fight it. His personal attorney, Greg Alton, had apparently advised him clearly that fighting was not a viable position given the documentation Diana had assembled, and Ryan had, in the months since the hearing, demonstrated something I hadn't fully expected. A degree of cooperation with the process that read less like strategy and more like a man trying to do the one thing he still could, which was not make it worse. The settlement required full repayment of the $647,000 over a structured period, plus damages. Ryan's portion of the payment was tied to the sale of assets he and Vanessa had accumulated during their marriage. 2 investment accounts, a piece of property Vanessa had purchased in her own name 18 months into the marriage, the proceeds of which I now understood had come at least partly from Cressline's fraudulent billing. Vanessa contested the settlement terms through her own attorney. She contested everything, right up until the point where her attorney apparently explained what contesting everything was going to cost her against what she stood to gain, and she signed. Diana called me when the final signatures were in. "It's done," she said. "The first payment will clear within 30 days. I was standing in the parking lot of a grocery store when she called, a bag of groceries in one hand and my keys in the other, the June heat sitting soft and heavy on my shoulders. "Thank you," I said. "Diana, for all of it." There was a brief silence. Then she said, "You did the hard part. I just made sure the right people were looking in the right directions." That's a generous way to describe 18 months of work. "It was interesting work," she said, and I could hear the smile in it. "Get some rest this weekend, Margaret." I drove home with the windows down and the radio on, something I hadn't done in longer than I could remember. Driven without thinking about the next thing, without running calculations, without monitoring myself for the signs of an ambush I might have missed. Just driven, just listened to the radio. The criminal trial began on a Tuesday in September, and I want to tell you about it honestly, which means telling you that it was not the cathartic, clarifying experience I had imagined during all those months when I was building toward it. It was exhausting. It was procedurally repetitive. It involved a great deal of sitting and waiting and listening to things I already knew described in language that was precise and airless and stripped of everything human. It involved seeing Ryan across a courtroom every day for 3 weeks, and it involved watching Vanessa, who had maintained throughout the entire preceding months the quality of controlled composure that I had come to recognize as her defining characteristic, finally begin to show the edges of it wearing through. She testified in her own defense. Her attorney had decided this was necessary, which told me they were not confident in the rest of their case. She was articulate and measured on the stand, and she gave a version of events in which everything had been well-intentioned, in which she had genuinely believed the physician's report was legitimate, in which she had been trying to protect a family asset from a woman she loved and worried about. She said the word love several times. She said it with apparent sincerity. The prosecutor, a woman named Ann Costello, who had been with the DA's office for 15 years and had a specialty in elder financial abuse cases, asked Vanessa about the December phone call. She played the recording. She asked Vanessa, in a quiet and completely level voice, to explain the phrase, "before she figures out what we're doing." Vanessa said it had been taken out of context. Ann Costello played it again. Vanessa said she had been referring to something else entirely. Ann Costello asked, specifically, what she had been referring to. Vanessa said she didn't recall the specific conversation. That was the moment, I think, when the jury stopped believing her. Not dramatically. There was no visible shift, no audible change in the room. But I'd been watching people's faces for 30 years in negotiations and client meetings and difficult conversations, and I could feel it, the way you feel a temperature change before you can measure it. They deliberated for 2 days. The verdicts came back on a Friday afternoon. Ryan, guilty of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Vanessa, guilty of fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and witness tampering. I sat in that courtroom and heard those words read out loud, and I felt, I am going to tell you what I actually felt, not what seems appropriate to feel. I felt very tired and very sad, and underneath that, quiet in a way I hadn't been quiet in years. Not happy, not triumphant, just quiet. Ryan's sentencing was 3 months after the verdict. He received a 28-month sentence with eligibility for early release after 18 months, given his cooperation with authorities and his lack of prior criminal history. His attorney had worked to establish the degree to which he had been influenced and directed by Vanessa. And while that did not absolve him, nor should it have, it was reflected in the differential between their sentences. Vanessa received 42 months. Her composure broke on the day of sentencing, finally and completely. Not in the dramatic way of the movies, not a collapse, but a fissure. The controlled surface fracturing in the courtroom when the judge read out the sentence and she understood it was real. She pressed her lips together hard and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then she was composed again, or as composed as 42 months allowed, and she was led out. I drove home alone. I made dinner alone. I sat at my table alone, and I thought about what it had cost. What all of it had cost. Not just in money, not just in the year and a half of my life spent building the case and surviving the house and sitting in courtrooms, but in the currency that doesn't have a name. The trust. The belief that the people closest to you are safe. The version of Ryan I'd still been holding on to somewhere. The version that lived in the same place as my memory of Gerald, and the part of me that was more past than present. I ate my dinner. I washed the dish. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. That was the last night I spent thinking primarily about what had been taken. After that, I started thinking about what I was going to do with what remained. But the first scholarship was established in November. I had been thinking about it since the summer, since a conversation with a woman named Ruth Garland, who ran a nonprofit in our county that provided legal assistance to older adults facing financial abuse. Diana had introduced us, thinking Ruth might be interested in the documentation from my case as a resource for other attorneys working similar situations. Ruth was small and energetic and spoke the way people speak when they have been furious about something for a long time and have learned to channel it productively. We had coffee twice before she asked me directly, "Would you consider being involved? Not just as a donor, as a voice." I thought about that. Being a voice, standing in rooms and saying, "This happened to me, here is how it happened, here is what you can do." "I'm not a public person," I said. "You don't have to be public," Ruth said. "You just have to be willing to tell the truth when it matters." I had been willing to tell the truth when it mattered for the past year and a half. I supposed I could continue. The Hayes Garland Scholarship for Legal Studies was endowed in November, funded through a portion of the civil settlement recovery. It was designed for students entering elder law or elder advocacy, specifically students from working-class backgrounds who might not otherwise pursue that specialty, because it rarely makes you rich. And the people who need those attorneys most are often the people who can least afford them. The naming was Ruth's idea. I had resisted it. Putting my name on something still felt, in those first months, like more visibility than I wanted. Ruth said, "Margaret, the whole point is that people know where it came from, so they know someone fought back and won." I let her put my name on it. The first recipient was a 24-year-old woman from Chillicothe named Destiny Osei, who was in her second year of law school and had written in her application essay about watching her grandmother lose her savings to a predatory reverse mortgage scheme. I read her essay 3 times. I invited her to lunch. She was serious and sharp and a little guarded, the way young people are when they've seen real hardship and aren't sure yet whether the person across from them is safe. I told her some of what had happened, not all of it, not yet, not to someone I'd just met, but enough. Enough that she understood the scholarship was not charity. It was a transaction between 2 people who had both seen something ugly done to someone who didn't deserve it. "Why law?" I asked her. She thought about it for a moment. "Because the people who did it to my grandmother knew the rules, and she didn't," she said. "That's the whole thing, right? They counted on her not knowing. I want to be the person who knows." I thought about Diana Reeves, who had known, who had built an argument from months of careful work, and laid it out in a courtroom, and let the truth do what truth does when it finally has enough room. "That's exactly right," I said. Hayes Construction's revenue grew by 19% the following fiscal year. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't magic and it wasn't simply resilience. It was work. It was the decision, made deliberately, and with full understanding of what it required, to reinvest in the company rather than pull back from it. It was bringing in 2 new project managers, younger, one of them a woman named Sandra Park, who had been underutilized at a competitor firm and who turned out to have a talent for client relationships that took the pressure off areas where I had always been thinner. It was renegotiating 4 supplier agreements with the kind of directness that comes from having already survived the hardest negotiation of your life. It was keeping Clara and keeping Priya and keeping the 26 employees who had stayed through everything and deserved to work for a company that knew how much they mattered. I hired a company attorney. That was one of Diana's final pieces of advice before we formally concluded our working relationship. Get someone in-house, someone whose whole job is to make sure you never have to be as surprised as you were. I hired a young man named Patrick Chow, who was meticulous and a little humorless and exactly what I needed. The legal work going forward would be his. The harder work, the work of knowing who I was and what I had and what I was willing to fight for, that was mine. That had always been mine. I had just needed a year and a half of being tested to understand it fully, Chet. I saw Ryan once, in the spring, before he was transferred to the facility where he'd serve his sentence. He had asked, through Greg Alton, whether I would be willing to meet. I sat with that request for a week. Diana didn't advise me either way. She said it was not a legal question, and she was right. It wasn't. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Neutral ground, public space. He came alone, and he looked like someone who had been sleeping badly and eating without attention. And he was 38 years old, and he looked older than that in a way that had nothing to do with years. We sat across from each other, and for a moment neither of us said anything. And I thought about the last time we'd sat across from each other in a neutral space. The kitchen. The morning after the hearing, him looking at his water glass. I thought about the basement window and the broom. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. Good, I said, because I don't know yet if I will. I think that's going to take longer than either of us can see from here. He nodded. He looked at his coffee. She told me you were losing it, he said. Not right away. Gradually. She'd point things out. Decisions she said were erratic, things she said she'd heard from employees. She built it up over time. He paused. And I wanted to believe it, I think, because if you were losing it, then it made sense that the company should transition. It made sense that we should be in charge. It gave me a reason that wasn't just greed. That honesty cost him something. I could see it cost him. You knew me your whole life, I said. You know who I am. Whatever she told you, you had 38 years of knowing me to measure it against. I know, he said. Then that's the thing you have to figure out, I said. Not what she told you, why you chose to believe it. He didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't expected one. Some questions take years to answer properly, and he was going to have time, more time than he wanted, in a place he hadn't chosen, to sit with it. We finished our coffee. When we stood to leave, he hesitated, and then he said, Mom, the company. It was everything Dad wanted. I knew that. I always knew that. I know you did, I said. I'm sorry I forgot it. I looked at my son, this complicated, imperfect, badly steered man who had my husband's jaw and my own stubbornness, and who had made choices that had hurt me in ways I was still measuring. And I said, Go do your time, Ryan. When you're out, we'll see where things are. I'm not going to tell you it'll be fine, because I don't know that. But I'm not going to tell you it's over either. That's the best I have right now. It was the truth. He knew it was the truth. He nodded once and walked to his car, and I stood in the parking lot in the April sunshine and watched him go. I didn't cry this time. I had cried enough over Ryan Hayes. There would be time for whatever came next when it came. Bus. There is something I want to say to you, whoever is listening, wherever you are watching this. I told this story not because I wanted sympathy, and not because I wanted to frighten you, and not because I believe my experience is unusual. I told it because I know, I have learned this now with the certainty of someone who has lived it, that what happened to me happens more than most people think. It happens in houses, and at kitchen tables, and in offices, and in family meetings where someone produces a document and says, just sign here in a voice that sounds like love but isn't. It happens to women and men who spent their lives building something real and then found themselves surrounded by people who had decided that real thing was easier to take than to earn. Here's what I know. You have the right to own what you built, not conditionally, not with apologies, not with the permission of people who are counting your years like a countdown to their inheritance. What you built with your hands and your years and your losses belongs to you. And the moment someone begins to position your ownership of it as a problem to be managed, that is the moment you need to start paying very close attention. Love does not look like paperwork that benefits the person handing you the pen. Love does not look like someone cataloging your lapses and reporting them to a lawyer. Love does not require you to surrender what is yours as proof that you trust the person asking. Those are not expressions of love. They are expressions of appetite dressed in love's language. And the distinction matters more than I can tell you. I spent months wondering if I was being unfair to Vanessa, if I was being a difficult mother-in-law, if my discomfort with her was simply grief and overprotection dressed up as intuition. I want to tell you something about that now. Your discomfort is data. You don't have to be certain before you start paying attention. You don't have to have proof before you call your accountant. You don't have to wait until the documents are on the table and the lawyer is at the door. Pay attention. Keep records. Know who your attorney is before you need them urgently. Know your finances the way you know your own name. Not because you are suspicious by nature, but because your life's work deserves a guardian, and that guardian should be you. And if the people around you tell you that caution is paranoia, that protecting yourself is selfishness, that needing to understand what's yours makes you difficult, look at who is saying it and what they stand to gain from your uncertainty. Because the people who love you genuinely will never need you to be uncertain about what belongs to you. Gerald taught me that. Not explicitly, not in a speech. He taught it in the way he kept the books honestly and insisted on fair contracts and said, we don't cut corners about work and money and people and everything else. He taught it in the way he treated the men who worked for him, in the way he treated me, in the way he looked at Ryan, and saw not an heir to a business, but a person who needed to learn what things cost. I carry that with me now. I carry it into every room I walk into. The office, the conference rooms, the lunch with Destiny Osei, where I told her some of the truth and watched her listen with the serious attention of someone learning how the world actually works. Hayes Construction is still standing. It is, in several measurable ways, stronger than it was before. The name on the building is still Gerald's name and mine, and the people who work inside it are still doing work that is done right and done honestly, because that is the only standard that ever mattered to either of us. I am 62 years old. I am not old, and I am not confused, and I am not diminished, and I am not done. I still arrive early, and I still read the numbers myself, and I still know every project manager and every foreman and every supplier by name. I still walk job sites occasionally, still stand inside structures that are going up, and think about what Gerald would see in them. The quality of the joints, the square of the framing, the way a good building announces its own integrity before it's even finished. I still miss him. That has not changed and will not. Some missing is not something you recover from. It's something you carry until you can't anymore. And that is not a weakness. It is the shape of love after the person is gone. But I'm still here, and this company is still here, and the people who believed they could take it from me, who looked at a 60-year-old widow with a 30-year-old company and decided she was the easiest target in the room, they're in prison cells right now, calculating what went wrong. What went wrong is simple. What went wrong is that they underestimated me. They saw a woman who had lost her husband and softened her edges from grief. They saw someone living alone in a house too big for one person. They saw someone who loved her son in the specific, vulnerable way that mothers love difficult children, with patience that can be read as passivity, with hope that can be read as blindness. They did not see the woman who had built everything she had from a one-bedroom apartment and a second-hand truck. They did not see the woman who had kept a company alive through the worst year of her life. They did not see the woman who had sat across from them at dinner for months, quiet and watchful, and building a case in the silence they took for surrender. They never saw that woman at all. That was their mistake. And it was the only mistake that mattered. I stood at the window of my office this morning, the same window I have stood at for years, looking out over the yard where the trucks line up in the mornings, and the crews come and go, and the ordinary business of a construction company unfolds in the particular reliable rhythm that Gerald and I fell in love with before we fully understood what we were building. And I thought about all of it, the whole long story of it, from the diner where he left a tip bigger than the meal to the courtroom where his company's name was finally, fully, irrevocably mine. He would have a lot to say about the past 2 years. He would say some of it too sharply and then feel bad about it. He would have opinions about Diana Reeves and strong opinions about Clara, and he would probably have made some joke in bad taste about the recording device that would have made me laugh despite myself. He would look at Hayes Construction as it stands today, the crews, the contracts, the new managers, the scholarship, the 19%, and he would not say he was proud because that wasn't his way. He would just look at it, and then he would look at me. And that look would be enough. I have been enough. I have always been enough. It just took someone trying to take everything to make me understand it fully. Whatever you are carrying, whatever someone is telling you that you are not capable of, not worthy of, not entitled to, I want you to hear this from someone who knows what it costs to find out the hard way. You built what you built. You earned what you earned. You have the right to stand in the middle of it and say, "This is mine, and I will not give it away." Say it clearly. Say it early. Say it before the documents appear and the lawyer calls and the person you trusted most is sitting across the table reading from a script someone else wrote. Say it now, while it's still simple, because the truth, the solid, buildable, unbreakable truth, is always simpler than the lie constructed to contain it. Gerald knew that. Now, finally, so do I.